Hi, everyone. This is my third NACIS. The circumstances of my life mean that I only manage to get back every 5 years or so. So it's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Aaron. And as mentioned, I work at the San Francisco International Airport Museum. Both the airport and the museum are owned and operated by the city and county of San Francisco. And in 1980, the airport created an arts program which eventually became the museum. So at the moment, there are 25 active galleries throughout the terminals. The museum has put on about 1,800 exhibitions since 1980. And the museum also has a permanent collection of 150,000 objects related to the history of the airport and commercial aviation. This is true. We have an amazing collection of air sickness bags. So if you don't know this, or if you weren't aware of the scale and the breadth of the museum's activities, don't worry. Most people don't know any of this. And I see part of my job as using the internet and a lot of maps to try and fix this problem. So I started writing my notes for this talk in long form last week and got to about the midway point and realized I'd written 2,500 words. So this is not that talk. I'm going to skip from peak to peak, dipping into the details where it seems necessary. And what that means is there may be points in this talk where you say, but what about ... And I encourage you to come and find me afterwards, and I'm happy to answer all of your questions. So in 2018, we made a web application hosted on the museum's Millsfield website of old aerial imagery of SFO. So this is a pretty standard leaflet-based web application. It has imagery that goes as far back as 1930, all the way up to 2022, sourced from the museum's collection, the GIS department at the airport, and the Special Collections Library at UC Santa Barbara. Fun fact, I didn't know this until I started this, SFO has its own map projection. Yeah. So our short-term goal for this project is to have imagery year over year from 1927 to whatever the present is. Our long-term goal is to do this for every other airport that SFO holds hands with. Another fun fact, there's only one structure from 1956 still standing at SFO, and that's the Arrivals and Departures Concourse course at Terminal 2, which coincidentally is where the SkyTerrace observation deck, which I'll mention in a moment, is located. So we made this map, and at the end of 2018, I was asked whether we could turn this web application into a touch-based interactive installation at the SkyTerrace observation deck, which was slated to open in early 2020. This is a photo of some early work we did to imagine what the interface for that application would look like. And in this picture, we were still thinking we might use a single large touch-enabled monitor mounted to the wall. We didn't do that, in part because if we had, ADA requirements would have dictated that only the bottom third of that monitor would have been available as an interactive surface. The rest of the screen wouldn't be able to be reached by people in wheelchairs, and that conveniently includes those little arrows. So this is an image of SFO from 2019 overlaid on the SFO of 1946. It's a little hard to see in this slide, sorry. But do you see that little angled terminal down in the bottom of the screen? That was the old Terminal 1, and it was demolished shortly after this photo was taken. And it's a good illustration of why we are keen to document all of these changes and the history of the airport. Two more fun facts. The museum maintains an openly licensed data set of historical architectural footprints, which we don't have time to talk about today. And the second fun fact is that this old non-existent Terminal 1 building is still on Google Maps today. Yeah. So one thing that's worth mentioning is that the airport has had a history of working with outside vendors to produce these kinds of digital interactive installations. And the truth is, they've almost always ended badly. So I was pretty keenly aware of this when I started, and the reality was that I think a lot of people didn't think that it would work. So the first part of the design process was to answer 4 questions. The first is, what is the least expensive hardware configuration that guarantees responsiveness and durability? It turns out the answer is just to use an iPad as a single-person controller connected to an external monitor. And one of the advantages that brings is one person is controlling the application and everyone else can see what's going on. And that's very important because it allows people to learn what the application does by watching. So on the face of it, an iPad might not seem like the best choice. They're pretty expensive, all things considered. But when you factor in a number of considerations, including the responsiveness of the touch support, which is just better than anything else, the durability of the screens, the processing power, the storage capacity, and the stability for long-running applications, and then compare it notably to vendor solutions, the cost is no longer prohibitive. Importantly, iPads have a fixed price, and there's a reasonable assurance that the same amount of money will buy better hardware in the future, or that less money will buy the same hardware. The second question is, what's the fastest way to develop, fix, and deploy the software running on that iPad? We settled on the idea of developing a web application and wrapping it in a framework like Cordova or Electron. Basically what that means is you can take a native web application and compile it down to native code and run it on an iOS or an Android device. Developing native applications has often been described as death by 1,000 details. It is a time-consuming process, and even the smallest changes can be a chore and a burden. So we already had a web application, so why not just use that? It would inevitably require some changes, but they would be minor compared to rewriting something from scratch. And additionally, the ability to target not 1 but 2 mobile platforms was a safeguard against vendor lock-in. And just as an editorial aside, Apple's native libraries for doing anything geo-related are just plain weird. So this is specific to the airport, which is how do we address the security concerns of a network-enabled device on the floor in the airport? And we made a pretty pragmatic decision, which is we bundle everything on the iPad and we turn off all the network interfaces. Any piece of hardware in an airport, and especially if it's connected to the internet, is going to be subject to scrutiny. And that scrutiny is warranted, but what it means is that it places demands on other people and other departments. And we're a busy airport, and so we will, a project like this will fall down the totem pole pretty quickly. So rather than fetching anything, including the 50 gigabytes worth of map tiles over the network, we just bundle them on the iPad. And the fourth and final consideration is, what is the fastest and least costly way to recover from a catastrophic failure? Because it will happen. It's hardware, not to mention software. And the answer is, just go to the Apple Store and buy another iPad. So I mentioned that I work for the city and county of San Francisco. We can't just do this. We have rules. But it does point to this idea of figuring out what the fastest way to recovery is. And the truth is, we could figure out a way to authorize this one-time purchase faster than we could do a purchase order and then getting a vendor to fulfill it. So that's what we did, and everything was working out fine until we realized that we couldn't use either Electron or Cordova to bundle our application. And the reason is this. Previously, we had simply been mirroring the iPad. But it was decided from an interface and an experience perspective that we didn't want to include the elements used to control the map that were on the iPad on the external display. So I was pretty surprised to discover that the only way to do this at the time, and I think it may still be the case, where this is a single application running on 2 screens with different content, is to use native iOS libraries. So I was pretty concerned that we were getting sucked back into the quicksand of native application development. Fortunately, both iOS and Android have what are called web views, which are first-class interface elements that allow you to bundle a web application in them. So effectively, your window becomes a web app. And importantly, in iOS, there is a way for the web application to send messages through JavaScript back up to the parent application that wraps your interface element, and vice versa. And so what that meant is, 5 minutes, wow. All right, this is going to be fast. What that meant is we could simply relay leaflet map events rather than touch events back up to iOS and back down to a second web application running in the external display. So that's the whole trick. But it's kind of amazing when you realize what that makes possible, because you suddenly have a bridge to talk to the native iOS application while your development is still as a web application, which is both faster and more portable. And it worked. And what we had done is we had created a generic framework for developing web applications that, with predictable and manageable costs, could be run offline and deployed in any 4x4-foot space in the airport. And I'm not talking 5 or 6 figures. I'm talking low 4 figures. So I mentioned that the SkyTerrace was meant to open in February of 2020, and that date got pushed back, and then COVID-19 happened, and passenger traffic cratered. Everyone started working from home. SkyTerrace was put on hold. Interestingly, the satellites were still running, so we still got aerial imagery that year, and this is what SFO looked like in 2020. And the good news when everyone came back is that the application I had been developing had been left running unattended, connected to a big honking monitor for 18 months, and everything still worked. Go me! But wait, the bad news is that no one wanted to touch any public surfaces anymore. Right? It doesn't matter whether that concern was warranted or not. The airport meets passengers where they are, and people weren't feeling comfortable. So then I was told 2 things. 1, the SkyTerrace was going to open in a month or 2, and 2, could you make it possible so that someone could control this map with their phone? So my first concern was how to do this with as little new code as possible. We just didn't have the time. So do you remember the way I mentioned that there was that bridge that allowed you to connect a web application to the native application? So that was the crux of the problem, and conveniently it turned out to be the solution. Essentially, all we had to do was replace that bridge with a network-enabled equivalent. This is the original sort of back of napkin sketch that I made. As a reminder, this is the original design for how things worked, and this is the updated version. So very, very briefly, we had to run a web server that did 2 things. 1, it served the original map application to a user's phone, and that application would communicate with the server using WebSockets, which is just bidirectional communications. The server would then parrot those messages back down to the iPad using server-sent events, which are just unidirectional communications, at which point the iPad just did everything it always did, which was send the messages back down to the external display. So it's just a fancier bucket brigade, but it's the same bucket brigade. And importantly, the iPad is still there. Okay, control of the map. I'm going to do this super quickly. There's a QR code. I wasn't super happy. QR code has an access code. It allows people to take control of the map for a certain amount of time, and then a new code appears and someone else can take control. So all of this introduced like a huge mountain of dependencies, but somehow we got it to work. And in September 2021, it opened, and there is a working interactive map application. And everything was great, amazingly, until iOS 15. So you may not remember, but iOS 14 was deemed unsafe at any speed. So we updated it, because I wasn't going to be the guy that left unpatched hardware on the floor in an airport. The problem was is that the minute we updated to iOS 15, it would no longer render the San Francisco Bay coastline, which was an important graphic element in our map. And the worst part was we knew about this all along. We'd seen this behavior in the introductions of the beta releases, and we just kind of hoped. And it never got fixed until iOS 16. And so I mention this just to say that like native application development is still kind of a high wire act. In the end, we were able to work around this with Brendan Liu's Protomaps. I do not have time for this. Protomaps is honestly the single most exciting thing in digital mapping I've seen in the last 10 years. Throughout all these changes, we've made sure that the touch-based application still works. There's a toggle. It's pretty cool as both a user and a developer to have an application that doesn't require any additional software to be loaded that allows you to control a map. But practically speaking, for this application, I still think the touch-based interactive is more inviting and more rewarding. In the interest of time, I'm not going to I have a whole thing here which I wish I could tell, but what I'm going to say is we try to make an effort not to open source the specific implementations that we build, but the underlying core libraries and assets. And so when we did the first touch-based iOS application, we released a starter kit for doing that sort of bucket brigade of messages. In a week or two, we will release a network-enabled version as well as a starter kit for the server component. It actually all works, but I just need to write the documentation. So if you want it sooner, please come and see me. And thank you.